squad in 1977. We used to play down the vault in Church Road in Brighton. There's an old burial vault, and this is completely true. The story's at the back of my scornflake of my poetry licence book. In 1977, the local punk scene in Brighton started going, and actually, I know what I'll do. Just because I'll read it. I will have to put the Ian Hunter bits on for this one, because the type in this is really... If I'd known in 2008 when I did my last book that finally at the age of 55 my eyes were going to start going, I've always had really good eyesight, it's always been some, you know, and suddenly it started sort of... Anyway, okay, I'm going to do this. We've got time. You know, I think we'll call this the last one, because we've got lots and lots more to do. So this is the story of the Brighton punk scene in 1977. Patrik won't have heard of this. Heard this one, I'm sure. It was when I first heard Patrik, I remember it was down the vault. Someone was playing the safety pin, single, and so anyway, it's called "Farewell to the Vault." The seismic impact of punk rock had spread quickly all over the country. By 1977, my hometown had its own thriving scene, based in the vault. This was, as the name suggested, an old 19th century burial vault, situated in North Road under Brighton Resources Centre, which was the headquarters of the local punk, anarchist and squatter movement. The vault was simultaneously a rehearsal space and a gig venue, and all the early Brighton punk bands played there. On regular visits home from university to visit my mum and my friends and to watch my beloved Brighton Hove Albion, I'd already seen 3 of Brighton's first bands, Joby and the Hooligans, Wrist Action and the legendary Piranhas, whose legacy I would one day help to revive. That would be nearly 30 years hence. Now it was time to heed Strummer's call and get up there myself. Together with 2 Brighton supporting mates, Max Cooter, vocals, and Miles Bajan, guitar, we formed Brighton Riot Squad and tried to find a drummer. But drummers were in very short supply, then as now. Even punk drummers were in short supply. You didn't need to be able to play the drums very well, but you still needed to own or have access to a kit. In desperation, we stuck an advert in the local paper and we got a call from Frank. Frank claimed to be a drummer, and he did have a kit. He also had that other essential rock and roll prerequisite, a car to drive his kit around in. Hooray! But when we met up for our first rehearsal, our glee was soon tempered by the realisation that having Frank in the band had 3 major disadvantages. 1, even by the more or less non-existent standards of punk, he couldn't play the drums. A dead turbot had a better sense of rhythm. 2, he had very dodgy right-wing views. His parents were refugees from somewhere in Eastern Europe, and the very sight of a red flag or the mention of the word socialism made him go nuts. 3, he was a teddy boy. The rivalry between Teds and punks in 1977 was media created and of course blown up out of all proportion, but it did exist. Local Teds used to hang around outside the vault looking for punks to beat up. For the painful results, listen to Intensive Care by Brighton's legendary Peter and the Test Tube Babies. And some punks were happy to return the compliment when the opportunity arose. Soon words of our unorthodox lineup got around, and one of Brighton Riot Squad's rehearsals in the vault was noisily invaded by another punk band, the very young, very drunk, more or less all-girl Molesters, plus their hangers-on. See, I told you, Brighton Riot Squad have got a Ted drummer, you wankers! You should be beating him up, not letting him play in your band. And where are your bondage trousers? You're wearing flares. You're hippies. For the record, we weren't wearing flares, but we weren't wearing bondage trousers either. We didn't think putting ridiculous amounts of money in Vivian Westwood's pocket, buying overpriced rubbish the Sun told you to wear, had much to do with punk rock. Frank's politics were far more of a problem for us than his dress sense. We liked being different. That was what punk was supposed to be about, and having a Ted drummer certainly was different. Moreover, once we started to practice, we soon realised that what we had perceived to be his biggest drawback of all, the fact that he couldn't play the drums, wasn't going to matter much at all. Max, our singer, was more or less tone deaf. Miles could play the requisite 3 chords, but he couldn't get them in the right order most of the time. And I was a complete disaster as a punk bass player. My self-indulgent styles totally crap for a punk band. That is in retrospect, of course. I thought the exact opposite at the time. Somehow, however, we got a set together, or we thought we did. A few of my earliest compositions, like Your Days Are Numbered and Son of Sam, plus covered of Pale Blue Eyes, and We're Going to Have a Real Good Time Together by the Velvet Underground. The collective inspiration of 3/4 of the band. I say 3/4. The 4th member had never heard of them until Elvis was the king. I wonder if you can guess which one that was. Joby Visigoth of Joby and the Hooligans designed a great poster for us. Brighton Riot Squad, it proclaimed at the top, above a large and brilliantly executed drawing of a riot policeman, truncheon raised menacingly over his head. We booked the vault, plastered posters all over Brighton, and waited with bated breath for our first gig. I asked vice versa of the legendary Poison Girls, who at the time were based in Brighton, if we could use their PA system. As long as nothing gets broken, she eventually agreed, with an understandable mixture of reluctance and suspicion. The big day came. The vault was packed. Our posters really looked good, and we had plastered them everywhere. Joby and the Hooligans supported us, and they were really good too. We weren't. We were absolutely awful. We were worse than Crystal Palace. We didn't manage to get the required 3 chords in the right order very much, and thanks to Frank, we're also completely out of time with each other. But we stuck to our guns and carried on. Vice versa stood at the front all the way through our set like a concerned mother hen, worried that the crowd were going to attack us, and therefore her PA, because we were so crap. But Vi needn't have worried. It was a punk rock gig. The crowd were used to seeing bands that couldn't play, and they didn't attack us. Rather the opposite, in fact. They paid us the ultimate mid-1977 punk rock compliment. They gobbed at us from start to finish. That was our one and only gig, which itself is pretty punk rock, I reckon. I'm still friendly with both Max and Miles nearly 30 years later. As for Frank, he's probably an Elvis impersonator somewhere. Probably in Hungary. I'm sure his parents came from Hungary. Wherever he is, I doubt very much that he's a drummer. It won't surprise you to learn that the local emergent Brighton punk scene managed to survive the demise of Brighton Riot Squad. It went from strength to strength. The Depressions, Nicky and the Dots, Devil's Dykes, Peter and the Test Tube Babies, the Dodgems, Smeggy and the Cheesy Bits, who became King Kurt, of course, to name but a few of the other early bands. And on my visits home, I turned up at the gigs whenever I could, and sometimes helped out on the door by putting up posters. But there was a developing problem. Before the punks had been let loose there, walls had been constructed in front of the actual burial chambers. The vibrations from rehearsals and gigs, plus general vandalism, caused breaches in them, and pretty soon skulls, bones and bits of coffins started. This is all completely true. Someone arrived at a gig with a skull they had found in a local telephone box. Then whole coffins started to appear, with still legible inscriptions, many with French names and plaques dating from the mid-1800s. Huguenot refugees, some having succumbed to some kind of plague. I distinctly remember one inscription, Victime de la Peste. This worried me. One evening I volunteered to take the money on the door, and on arrival the first thing I saw was a little baby's lead coffin, about a foot long, with the bones still inside. With due deference, I moved the bones to one end and used the rest as a cash box. If all this had happened 10 years later, I guess the Vault would have become the most popular goth or death metal venue in the world. Surely this was the very definition of death metal, or at least death punk. But there weren't any goths or death metalers then, and many of us were actually rather uneasy about the whole thing. Not just because it all seemed a bit disrespectful. I remember sitting at the Three Jolly Butchers pub over the road, having a discussion about exactly how long a plague virus could survive. Eventually, with skeletons quite literally coming out of the closet all the time, as it were, things got too much. The local council took action and the vault's doors closed for good. When a mysterious fascist-perpetrated fire burned down the resources centre, that colourful chapter in Brighton's musical history came to an end, though it is preserved for posterity on 2 compilation albums, Voltage 78 and Voltage 79, on Brighton's seminal Atrix record label. There you go.